Hey everyone. So today we're going to go through week 9 webinar, um, which is going to be on securing your APIs. I think this is one of the, especially for new developers, one of the more overlooked areas, which you know, like I'm sure most of you like super excited and get ready to and start building things. I think that this is something that can burn you quite a bit if you actually build something really cool. You get going and you get some traction, but you haven't secured it. Yeah, that can be pretty scary. There's a cool story that on in one of the older Udacity courses on Steve Huffman. I think the course is called Web Development. Maybe it's CS202 or something. Maybe I'll just look it up. CS202. Steve Huffman, Udacity, but essentially he talks about so he's the guy that built or him and CS253. That's it. Sorry, this is it over here. If you want to take a look, this is a course built by well presented by Steve Huffman, one of the co-founders of Reddit. So it's pretty cool to hear how they stored all of the user information on his computer, which obviously got stolen. Well, not which got stolen. So that was a big security scare. So yeah, it's pretty important to secure your applications, and then obviously, therefore, that means secure your APIs. So basically, what we'll touch on today is basically just recap different areas that are important for the securing of your APIs, and that's OAuth and OAuth 2. We won't go into too much detail on that because we've discussed it in detail already. And then securing them on your own, and then making sure that you don't have people taking advantage of your APIs or any other part of your application. So just to recap what we spoke about in a previous webinar, OAuth and OAuth 2 are both widely used. It's a really good idea to learn OAuth and understand how it was implemented, because it just shows if you can understand the progression and the way in which the methodology has been improved over time. That will really help you to think in terms of security and always keeping your application secure. So yeah, it's a really good idea for you to really like figure out how OAuth works, but don't actually use it on your applications. OAuth 2 is what you should use if you want to use a third party. Well, let me not say what you should use, but it's probably a lot better to use it. Obviously, it's the newer version. And so yeah, this is still complex, well, not complicated, but complex. Lots of little things to know. Essentially, you're going to have to know some JavaScript to implement it the way that Udacity does in the course that you guys have gone through. I'm sure you've seen that already. And if you haven't, you'll see it soon. I think it's Lorenzo Brown. He does it. He uses OAuth 2. He goes through it pretty quickly. So yeah, it's kind of important to just figure out the basics of JavaScript first before diving into it, and then just really take your time, slow down. Like some of the concepts in this nano degree have been like, obviously it's different for every person. So some people go through certain parts faster than others and vice versa. But personally, way back when I did it, I found that they brushed through it really, really quickly, and I couldn't pick it up as quickly as and easily as, say, like learning other concepts earlier on in the nano degree. But this is like something that becomes a good thing in the end, because then you have to slow down and really learn it yourself. And when you do, because you took so much time, it's very unlikely that you'll forget it. So yeah, I would just go through OAuth 2 and really try and implement it yourself really, really well, and use a whole bunch of additional resources besides what is provided by Udacity. To be honest, the best is to just actually go to the documentation from whoever the provider is. So you can, if you go to Google, you can implement it a bunch of different ways with them, or with Facebook, I think, or with LinkedIn, or with GitHub. So yeah, I would suggest you just get a lot of practice with that. So another good thing that you can do is just simply go straight to the OAuth 2 documentation and just read through it. It's a bit tedious, but it's really, so here we go. Just go to Python and just basically take your time and try and go through it. So yeah, Flask OAuth lib. If you go to this and you work your way through this, you should be able to get some good experience in implementing security in your APIs. Cool. So the next thing is do it yourself. So this was before OAuth and OAuth 2, this is what everybody did, and there were a lot of people who were lazy and took shortcuts, and hackers or people looking for weak points in your security are always going to be a step ahead. So this is pretty risky, but it is a fantastic thing to do if you understand what you're doing, or if the information that your application is storing and processing is not super important to a large group of people, then this is also a great way to do it. And then you're not reliant on any third party. I would say though, one thing that's really important to keep in mind if you go this way in securing your APIs is that it's really going to depend what you do. So when you're doing APIs, you're not really going to be using Django, if you're building with a framework. If you're using Django, you probably would use Django REST framework for your APIs, and there's plenty of good tutorials on that. But the cool thing with that is doing it yourself with Django REST framework is very, very, very easy compared, not in itself, but compared to implementing it yourself with Flask. But nevertheless, I think that you could really benefit by trying to implement it yourself. Especially, yeah, but definitely first with Flask and then second with Django. So now, if you do decide to do it yourself, right, or even whichever route you decide to take, whether you do it yourself, or you go through, using something like OAuth, one of its extensions, essentially, yeah, sorry, got a bit like I lost my train of thought there. But essentially, what I'm saying is that if you decide to go either by yourself or by using a authorization protocol, so basically just OAuth 2, then there's still things that you're really going to keep in mind that are important to both of these, especially with regard to securing your APIs. And so the most important things is to get your head around environment variables. So essentially, what this means is that when you set up your application, so in the next few steps, you may or may not have done it, depending how far you are in this nanodegree. But the next steps are when you set up your server on a Linux instance, and then launch it with some sort of provider, so Heroku or DigitalOcean or Linode, I think is one, or AWS, or Google Cloud Platform, whichever one you launch your application with. So basically, this is where your application will be hosted, and essentially it'll be sitting on some sort of virtual machine. No, not necessarily, but that's a good way to learn, and I think it's the way that Udacity does it. But when you do that, you're going to have a whole bunch of configuration settings, depending on what application you're using, what operating system you're using, and how secure it needs to be. And essentially what this means is that you're going to have a whole bunch of environment variables. So it'll be passwords that you're storing, secret keys, tokens, maybe certain things that you store when you, certain things that you cache, certain information in the cookies. There's a whole bunch of stuff that you really need to, that come along with your application. And if you're not careful with this, all of this stuff could be accessible to anybody who gains access to the system on which your application is running. This is like super, super important. And one way to really get around this is by using environment variables. So I've linked a resource. It's not long, it's like 15 minutes. That's not related to Udacity, but it's a cool resource for setting up your environment variables. It's done in Django, but the concept is identical, and you'll see you'll be able to do this in Flask or anything else. And essentially all you're doing is that if you have passwords or secret keys or anything like that, it all gets hidden and it doesn't sit on your application wherever you're hosting it. So yeah, this is integral. If you want to secure your APIs and you don't do this, then you're not securing your APIs. So there's two links there. So the first one, I should have written that, but the first one is Windows, and the second one is for Mac and Linux. So depending on what you're working on, yeah, it's the same video, but just for different operating systems. So if you do, if you get that set up, there's still a couple of other things that you want to start thinking about. And so one of those would be production versus development environments. So, this goes down the long path of the DevOps and continuous integration. But essentially, you're probably going to, whenever you make changes to your application, you probably don't want to have them sitting on your production, your live server that's running that all of your users are using. You probably want to test it first. And the way to test it is to have it live and running. And so essentially most people will have a production server and a development server. So the one looks like the other for all intents and purposes, but you want to make sure that before just launching, and even if you've done testing and stuff, you actually want to test on an close to an identical environment. But in case something goes wrong, and things always do go wrong, you want to do this on a development environment and not on your production environment. So basically, if say you make a change, you do a change, you go from, say you had OAuth and then you change it and you put on OAuth 2 and everything seems to work, and then you push it to production and your whole application crashes and nobody can log in. That'd be terrible, and you'd wish that you still had your OAuth. So I guess you could roll back, but a far better way of doing it is to have to test by having a test environment and a production environment. And then, sorry, I'm confusing two issues. You want a test server and you want a production server. And the way that you would do this is by having a test environment and a production environment. So this is not exactly linked to securing your APIs, but if you want to have a secure application, do you want to start thinking about this? So that's more the reason that I'm putting this in. This is not something you need right now, but for secure API development, you're going to want to have two separate servers and two separate environments so that you test before you deploy to production. Then the last thing to think about is rate limiting. So this is also something that makes OAuth 2 great, but basically you want to know who is using your application and how often they're using it, so that you don't have people that are abusing it. There's like, it could be malicious bots of all different types, although a lot of bots are just scrapers. They're just taking all the information from your website, which is fine, but it's not fine when it's using up all the resources and your server is serving this scraper. And so that normal users, have to sit and wait and can't use your application. And you also get denial of service errors, which is basically when people do this on purpose so that your application essentially becomes unusable to the normal people that want to use it. So you really, one way to do this is to make sure you know who is using it, and then block certain IPs, and then to limit the number of requests that someone can use. So I guess what you'd essentially do is figure out what's the reasonable amount that a user would use your service, and then cap the amounts there. So yeah, limit the rate of requests that different users can make. This could be also something, although it's not super important now, but essentially this could be a situation where you can charge for more. And I think that this is what Google does with a lot of its API. So if you look at the Maps API, there's so many things you can do with it, but it's free on a certain tier, but for more requests, you basically would be charged. So yeah, not all of this is super, super essential, but it's really, really important to keep it in mind at the very least. It's not super essential to know this all backwards right now, but it is very important to keep these things in mind while you're trying to secure your APIs. So hopefully, thinking through all of this stuff while you go through the Udacity course where you secure it and you implement OAuth 2, if you have a lot of this at the back of your mind, hopefully it will allow you to learn and absorb it a lot faster. So just checking if there's any questions. If there aren't any questions, then no questions. Then we'll leave it at that. But yeah, just if you do have any, just ask on Slack. And I hope everything's going well with everybody. And we'll see you at the next webinar. Cool. Thanks. Bye.